Welcome back to Perspectives on Human Communication. This week is pretty exciting because we get to start on our first theory, actual theory of communication. We've been talking for a couple of class periods about theorizing and some of the concepts and ideas behind what makes a good theory and how to critique a theory, but now we actually get to dive into an actual theory. And we're going to start with a theory that really bridges intrapersonal communication when we speak to and with ourselves, and interpersonal communication when we speak with others. And that theory is symbolic interpretivism by George Herbert Mead. We'll give you in this overview video a real quick kind of synopsis of the theory. And for each of these theories, the text is going to introduce assumptions behind that theory. And it's really important that you begin to understand what those assumptions are. So I'll quickly introduce those assumptions and maybe we'll give an example or two. So first, a little bit of the backstory behind George Herbert Mead. Mead was a scholar at the University of Chicago. He was actually, as your book mentions, he was a sociologist, but he factored in communication so prominently in what he looked at and what he studied that communication theorists have used this theory a lot in trying to understand intra and interpersonal communication. So he actually, as a scholar, published very little during his career, but he had some students who picked up his work after he was done and really assembled from course notes a book that was titled Mind, Self, and Society in 1934. One of his key students was Herbert Blumer, and it was actually Blumer that coined the title or the name of this theory, symbolic interaction, which is why we call it symbolic interactionism theory. And it was Blumer who was a part of that book composition process as well. So Mead's key idea was that he thought that our ability to speak to one another and to do so empathically was at the core of our existence. So we're going to look at some of the assumptions underneath this theory really quickly. First, just by way of introduction, symbolic interaction centers on the relationship between symbols and interaction. So how are people conducting themselves symbolically, and what does that do to both frame and compose and affect the interactions? The way this theory looks at people is as active, reflective participants within the given context. With whichever context you're in, that you're interacting with in, you are an active, reflective part of that process, of that context. And so the key kind of concepts are meaning, language, and thought. And all of these, the creation of meaning, using language to do that, and how it relates to thought, those are going to be the core of symbolic interactionism. So what are the assumptions? There's three assumptions, and then the assumptions, each assumption has some corollaries or some key ideas associated with it. So the first assumption is the importance of meaning creation in human behavior. So if you break that down into these core ideas or the corollaries, one, we as humans act toward each other on the basis of meanings that we have for each other and about ourselves. Okay, so our actions are guided and created and really framed by these meanings that we're creating and that we already have about ourselves and about that other that we're interacting with. And when we're talking about two people communicating with each other and speaking to each other, we often talk about them using the word interlocutor. So locution is the idea of communicating, speaking, and so when we have interlocution or interlocutors, that's what they're doing, is communicating with each other. The second corollary idea is this notion that meaning is created actually during interaction between people. And that's a key idea that is going to come across in a number of interpersonal theories, that meaning happens between people. It doesn't happen alone in our minds, but together in interaction. It's what happens in between. And we talked a little bit about that when we were talking about the natures of communication. The third corollary here is that meaning is actually modified through our interpretive process while we're in dialogue. And so the fact that each of us in communication often has an internal monologue spinning in our mind during the interaction where we're wondering, does this person like me? What do they think about what I just said? Or you're factoring other things in. And Mead called this minding, the idea of an internal inner dialogue that's happening. He used the term minding to talk about that. Assumption number 2 is this the idea that self-concept factors into these interactions. So we've got the process of meaning creation, but we also have the person thinking about self-concept. So the corollaries are each of us develops a self-concept about ourselves through interaction with others, right? And we'll talk a lot about that. The reflective self was a concept that was really important to Mead, and we'll talk about reflective appraisals a little bit when we get into class. But that's a key concept. Mead actually called it the looking glass self. When we look into other people's eyes or faces, we get a reflection back of ourselves. The second corollary here is that self-concepts provide an important motive for our behavior, that a lot of what we do is motivated by our self-concept. Third assumption is the relationship between the individual and society. So we've got meaning, we've got self, and now we've got society. So that understanding the connection or disconnection between the person and the larger society is a really important part of this whole theory. So the corollaries are people and groups are influenced by cultural and social processes. Now, some of you at this point are going to step back and go, we're saying things that are a little bit obvious, but that's exactly what some theories do, is they step back and they actually give name to things that people do sometimes naturally or that are just a part of life. And the theory is trying to describe that, like what is taking place here. Because people in interaction, we know that people interact all the time, but to step back and actually begin to define variables in that process and how those variables relate to each other, that's exactly what theories are all about. And then from those theories, once we define and describe, then we can generate insights from those. Okay, so people and groups are influenced by cultural and social processes, things going on around us impact us. Yes, that's corollary 1. And corollary 2 is that social structure is worked out through social interaction. Social meaning the structure of humans and the hierarchies that exist, don't just happen organically by themselves. It takes people to engage, and then those structures are built up through that social interaction. So those are the 3 assumptions behind social interaction theory, and we will explore this theory and use it in class. We'll see you then.